समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
There were merchants from the lands of all the world's 7 climes gathered in the port which had no equal in the world. So the medieval diplomat Kamaluddin Abdul Razak Samarkandi recorded on his journey in 1441 as he made his way from the Timurid emperor's capital in Central Asia to Kozhikode and then to Vijayanagara, where he was to meet with the great king Devaraya II. The port was packed with horses, pearls, sacks of precious jewels, spices. There was, and I quote, every precious commodity made glittering by the sun, moon, and cloud. Egyptians, Syrians, Farsis, Turkestanis, men from Zanzibar and the Maldives, from India and Sumatra and China, were all meeting for the monsoon to begin blowing the ships towards Malabar. Few people, I'm guessing, haven't heard of the island port at which Kamaluddin was waiting just short of 6 centuries ago. It was Hormuz, from which the strait at the center of the war between Israel and the United States on the one hand and Iran on the other takes its name. Till the bombing began, Hormuz was mainly a tourist site famous for its salt goddess, which is a stunning system of salt mountains and caves, as well as the ruins of an old colonial fort and church. Today, of course, the straits are also best known for being the choke point that provides Iran its ultimate strategic leverage. And I'll be giving some context to this conflict by exploring the history of what is unfolding. From Hormuz to Qasab, in the bit of Oman that dangles just off the southern end of the United Arab Emirates, which you can see in the map that's on screen now. So from Hormuz to Qasab is just some 40 kilometers or so. The passage in that 40 kilometers, which can be used by big oil tankers, is even narrower, just some 3 kilometers either way. Yet this narrow strait is the second largest transit route after Malacca for crude oil and the very largest for natural gas. Even though we think the story seems to be all about oil, it's actually much, much older. It goes back all the time to a world which was governed by the wind, not hydrocarbons. Even in the medieval era, great empires were brushing up against each other in Hormuz. This might seem like a bit more of a history class than even the usual episodes of Explorer, but trust me, it's an utterly fascinating story. Try swapping some of the names out with the modern day equivalents, which will be pretty clear as you hear the story. And 500-year-old manuscripts sound like they were newspaper reports we read yesterday on the ongoing war. From at least the 12th century, the historian Shireen Musvi has shown, we have an abundant record of the deep trading links between Iran and India. Though, of course, I know neither country existed then. I want to keep things simple, so bear with me for this anachronism, which my professors back at university would not have been very happy with. Anyway, the first Indian reference to Hormuz comes not even 500 years ago, but much, much older. It's from a Sanskrit text composed in the 13th century, written by Sarvananda. It records that someone called Jagadu had stationed an agent in Hormuz to handle the affairs of a ship that plied between the port of Cambay and Hormuz. Another manuscript records orders sent from someone called Jayataka at Patan, yes, the same Patan in modern Gujarat, to his agent Vijay Simha at Goga. The orders state that when a ship from Hormuz arrived, Vijay Sama should immediately send news of the goods and breeds of horses it brought. Lots of evidence suggests rulers understood the importance of well-regulated free trade back then. An inscription by the Kakatiya king Ganapati Deva, issued in 1166, yes, the 12th century, promised traders in his realm not to seize shipwrecked or stolen merchandise and to charge only the legally ordained taxes. The king was trying to build confidence in his system and draw business to his reign. They were the Yung and Ming emperors of China who dispatched the great treasure fleets of the Grand Admiral Zheng He. And the other great superpower of the time, India, represented by the rulers of Vijayanagara, but also the great trading fleets of the Gujarat Sultanate. The last powerful ruler from Hormuz, the vizier who served as caretaker of its young prince, which we'll talk more about, was actually from Bengal, which was then ruled by Sultan Ahmad Shah and his son, later Muzaffar Shah II. And of course, there were the Ottomans who, as we shall see, almost ended up becoming the preeminent power in the Indian Ocean. Later, the Portuguese got that role, only to be shoved aside by the British and then, of course, the Americans. They all did so through tactics we today call regime change. Empires change, the things empires do, not so much. The lesson for India from all of this is how it allowed regional primacy to slip from its grasp, and the enormous price Asia as a whole paid for letting foreign powers shape the course of history. The India of that time was not autarkic or hostile to the global world. It traded boldly and confidently across the planet. Yet, it made some poor strategic choices for which, arguably, we're still paying the price. We can't afford, obviously, to make those mistakes again. Even as Kamaluddin, the Central Asian diplomat, arrived in Hormuz, the empire he represented was in decline. Following the death of Taimur in 1405, his successors lost much of their Persian territory to the so-called White Sheep Turkmen, a confederation of Sunni tribes of Turkic origin. Like Taimur's own ancestors had once done, the nomadic White Sheep Turkmen brushed aside the urban established order. Their leader, Karayuluk Uthman Beg, took control of eastern Turkey as well as Armenia, Azerbaijan, much of Iran, Iraq, and Oman. The White Sheep Turkmen, of course, would in turn give way to the Safavid Empire in Persia and the Ottomans in Turkey. But that story, in which India again had a big role, we'll have to leave for another day. From his memoirs, we know Kamaluddin marveled at Hormuz's metropolitan culture. He wrote, "Adherents of various religions, even infidels, are many in that city, but they deal equitably with all." The people, he observed, were a mix in their character and personality of, and I quote again, the glibness of Iraqis and the mysteriousness of Indians. Taimur's empire, if you read Mongol history, had once been very similar, of course. Though, as Kamaluddin's repeated miseries from seasickness and his terror of the ocean suggest, the kings of Central Asia preferred to stray on dry land, which was probably their undoing eventually, because wealth was to be had on the oceans. The Indian model of these oceanic commons, if we can call them that, was to keep a light touch. The sovereign was expected to protect merchant traffic from the ever-present threat of pirates. The Arabs, after all, invaded Sindh not because of some religious frenzy, historian Vijay Lakshmi has noted, but to punish the pirates who plundered 8 vessels sent by Sri Lanka to the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. The military in Basra, similarly, raided pirate bases in Bahrain, from where there were raids being conducted on merchant traffic through Hormuz to India and China. And there was uniform praise for Kozhikode's scrupulous enforcement of law and order. We know that Kamaluddin wasn't alone in traveling to Hormuz, though. The great Venetian traveler Marco Polo visited the port in 1272 on his way to China. For several days, Marco writes, he traveled through a great plain at constant peril from bandits. Then he reached a coastal area, likely near what we now call Bandar Abbas, the great port city in Iran, marked by, and I quote, beautiful rivers and many date palms and birds, including francolins and parrots and others that are quite unlike ours. The port, Marco would find, was packed with merchants from every part of India, bringing all sorts of spices, precious stones and pearls, silk and gold fabrics, elephants' tusks, and many other products. And to India, horses flowed from Central Asia. Horses because they could not be bred in the hotter Indian climate. From Marcos Polo's account, it seems he was unimpressed by the local ships he found in Hormuz, which were made without any metal nails and primitive compared to the European counterparts that he was familiar with in Venice. Therefore, Marco decided to travel overland, though he did take a ship on the return leg of his voyage, traveling back through East Asia and on to the Middle East, past India, and back home to Venice. The great voyager Zheng, a eunuch who served the Ming lords and rose to the rank of Grand Admiral of their fleet, also arrived in the Indian Ocean, leading a series of 7 great expeditions which ran from 1403 to 1431. That's just before Kamaluddin begins his journey to India. The treasure fleet waged brutal wars where it saw reason, laying waste to the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, which of course China actually owns today. For the most part, the historian Jeff Wade tells us, the Chinese used these voyages to advertise the wealth and power of their enterprise. Zenki's fleet bore gifts of gold, silver, porcelain, and silk, and took back all sorts of things like ostriches, camels, and ivory, even the Sultan of Bengal, Ghiyasuddin Shah's pet giraffe. Like many modern powers, the Chinese demanded local rulers accept their ordained positions as outer planets circling the great Ming Empire's sun. But it didn't commit too much wealth and muscle to this business. The Yongle Emperor gave lavish gifts to the Zamorin or ruler of Malabar. The Ming, though, were not interested in involving themselves militarily, as the Portuguese would later do. The historian Tansen Sen records that the Ming court once received letters from Jalaluddin Muhammad, the ruler of Bengal, asking for their help in a battle that was going on against the Sultan of Jaunpur. The Yongle Emperor, probably wisely, did not give Jalaluddin the military assistance he sought, and instead counseled both these leaders to solve their problems locally. The real work of China, after all, was commercial, not bossing around the place. Large numbers of Chinese merchants traveling from their ports to Kozhikode took on cloves and other spices, which then went on to Hormuz. There they took on board, yes, horses, what else, but pearls and precious stones, and loaded up with pepper on the return trip home from the Malabar coast. The princes of Hormuz were acutely aware of China's market and spent several ambassadors to the Ming court with gifts of horses, Ralph Cowes and Roderick Stark have recorded. From Kamaluddin's account, among others, we know that the Kozhikode rulers practiced what we might today call free trade, a remarkable feature of a globalized economy, which back then, centuries ago, understood that tariffs ultimately choke everyone's wealth. It is the custom of other ports to seize as a windfall and plunder any ship headed for one port but driven by God's destiny to take refuge in another, Kamaluddin noted. However, in Calicut, no matter where a ship is from and where it is headed, if it docks there, they treat it like any other ship. This is what he wrote. The Vijayanagar king Devaraya II, the scholar Philip Waggoner tells us, consciously adopted forms of dress and behavior that were familiar to trade representatives and ambassadors from the Islamicate world on India's doorstep. Kamaluddin, you see, was deeply uncomfortable with Kozhikode's bare-chested, veshti-wearing rulers and citizens. But he was instantly comforted by Devaraya's opulent silk. This was the conscious use of culture and idiom to wrest what is called a soft power advantage. After all, Indian executives who visit markets overseas today wear suits for a reason. Less than a century after Kamaluddin's journey, though, the regional order had begun to disintegrate under the challenge of a European power that entered the region, the Portuguese. This tiny Atlantic coast nation rose to power propelled by, among many other things, by technology. The speed and maneuverability of the triangular lateen sail the Portuguese oceanic ships had mastered, and the lethal effect of their hull-mounted broadside cannon laid waste to their rivals. The historian Carlo Cipolla argued in path-breaking work written in 1965. The later work of brilliant Indian historians like Sanjay Subramaniam and K.N. Chaudhary gave us reason to nuance this portrait. These historians argued that while the Portuguese did in fact have this revolutionary military technology, their real success was to basically run an extortionist operation, uh, basically imposing more of an economic cost on near peers in the military sphere than those countries thought were, those rulers, thought were worth paying. After all, a large part of Hormuz's reputation lay on its claim to be a land of Aman or peace. Then, as now, that peace or Aman didn't last. The old world was disintegrating, and Hormuz would be trapped at the center of one of the great storms unleashed by the goddess of history. Late in the summer of 1498, just half a century after Kamaluddin's journey, Vasco da Gama arrived in Kozhikode. The high noon of Asian power, as we have seen, had not quite completely passed. Early in the next century, General Alfonso de Albuquerque, who became the first Duke of Goa, seized the idyllic port from the Sultan of Bijapur. The conquest had been preceded in 1507 by the seizure of Hormuz. Elaine Sanko's colorful account of the battle tells us that it was a close-run affair. Hormuz was well prepared for a long siege, and its Bengali vizier was not at all overawed by Portuguese power. Faced with resistance, Alfonso hid his craft behind the biggest ship in port, an 800-ton behemoth from Gujarat, threatening to destroy it if his demands were not met. Sounds familiar? Maybe something happening in Hormuz now is almost identical. Ferocious fighting broke out between Persian archers and the Portuguese fleet. The European cannon, though, eventually told. The fighting was followed by negotiations between Alfonso and the teenage king of Hormuz, Saifuddin, his Bengali minister who was called Haga Ata, and his right-hand man, Rais Nuruddin Fali. The deal they struck gave the king continued control of Hormuz, but in return for paying a big tribute to Portugal. This didn't end the story though, because the Portuguese returned in 1515 after taking Goa and Malacca. This time, the Portuguese secured a deal with Turan Shah, who had taken over Hormuz after poisoning his older brother, Saif. Turan Shah agreed to become a vassal in return for the Portuguese protection. Lord Turusha, King of Hormuz, you are now a knight. By these arms that I grant to thee, and by the friendship of the King of Portugal, Alfonso declaimed. In return, he said, all those knights and fidalgos shall serve you to our deaths, and so we order the heads of any whom you deem deserving cut off. From its birth in the 16th century, of course, Portuguese power was far from uncontested. The Mamluks did try in 1509 to support the fleet at Diu with the help of Ottoman shipwrights. The Mamluks, though, were facing severe pressure from the rising empire in Istanbul and just could not sustain the effort. They were conquered by the Ottoman Emperor Selim I in 1517, just 8 years later. The Gujarat Sultanate, for its part, kept trying to push back against the Portuguese, but soon realized it was much cheaper to pay protection money than to having to battle big, powerful naval forces endlessly. The one power that did have the resources and the will to push back against the Portuguese were the Ottomans. The historian Giancarlo Casale has shown that the Ottomans came within a hair's breadth of success, as their continental power also expanded southwards into Iraq and the Hejaz. Istanbul, though, was also locked in great power competition in its own neighborhood, and the rulers of Turkey decided after 3 decades of fighting the Portuguese that their time, money, and soldiers were better used pushing the Habsburg dynasty back in the Mediterranean closer to home. And from 1600, of course, a new power was rising which would brush aside the Sultanate of Gujarat, the Mughals who had become Gujarat's overlords, and the Portuguese. The long rise of the East India Company had begun. The story from then, at least to Indians, is pretty well known, and I shan't recount it here. The end of the story I've told of in an earlier episode of Explorer, which came out just a few weeks ago. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America's president, met King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia on the naval ship Quincy in February 1945 as the Second World War was drawing to a close. Freshly slaughtered sheep had to be made available for the royal guest mid-ocean. The US Navy had to scuttle efforts to bring the royal harem on board. An army of coffee servers, scullions, slaves, and court astrologers all had to be accommodated. And behind all of this incredible tamasha was a deadly serious business. Ever since the discovery of massive Saudi oil deposits in 1938, historian Tyler Priest has written, the center of gravity of the global hydrocarbon industry moved for the first time to West Asia, or the Middle East. Large-scale American investments soon followed. The US during the Second World War had supplied almost 80% of the petroleum needs of its European allies through the Second World War. The lifting of price control now threatened these economies, and enhanced Saudi production helped bring oil costs down again. Late in 1944, President Roosevelt had told a British diplomat, I quote, Persian oil is yours, we share the oil of Iraq and Kuwait. As for Saudi Arabian oil, it is ours. An empire had once again begun to dissolve into the sands of time, and a new one was rising. The British were out, America was in. This empire of oil, of course, didn't come cheap. In the course of the Second World War itself, the US had set up bases in Iran, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. To these, as the Cold War unfolded, it had to add facilities in Bahrain, Pakistan, Iraq, and across Northern Africa. The scholar John Gaddis has argued the US didn't set out to get an empire, but it ended up with one, just as the British had introduced a trading company to Asia and ended up with kingdom upon kingdom. Empires are expensive though. Arthur Herman estimated in a 2014 analysis that, and I quote, keeping the region's shipping lanes, including the Strait of Hormuz open to tanker traffic cost the Pentagon on average $50 billion a year, a service that earns us the undying enmity of populations in that region. That's one reason, as you know, that President Donald Trump had promised constantly to avoid becoming embroiled in Middle Eastern wars. His director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, had publicly, repeatedly opposed going to war with Iran. The past is present though, and it's almost as if forces we barely sense or understand drive leaders to make decisions very similar to the ones that were made before. There are real lessons though for us to learn from medieval India's management of the Indian Ocean all those centuries ago. This was a system which relied not on military force and coercive intervention, but the incentivization of free trade and cultural openness. The idea that India might once again emerge as the cornerstone of the regional order might seem hopelessly unrealistic. And perhaps it is. Then again, who knows? As I just said, the past is also the present. Thank you for joining this episode of The Print Explorer. And be back with you again next week.